Welcome to Devotional Drops, where we explore the richness of Scripture and how it speaks to our lives today. In this episode, we're reflecting on the Matthew 27:46. Have you ever wondered what the darkest moment in history was? Some might point to wars or disasters, but I'd argue it was when God Himself cried out feeling abandoned, a moment that changed everything we understand about suffering.
That's such a profound way to look at Jesus' cry from the cross. And what's fascinating is how this connects to modern psychology's understanding of abandonment trauma.
Well, here's what's really interesting. Jesus wasn't just expressing raw emotion, He was actually quoting Psalm 22, a piece of ancient poetry that begins in complete despair, but ends in triumph. It's like He was telling us something deeper about suffering.
Hmm. That reminds me of how trauma therapists often talk about the importance of seeing the whole story, not just the painful moment.
You know what's really mind-blowing? This pattern of apparent abandonment followed by revelation shows up throughout history. Take Joseph in Egypt, sold into slavery, falsely accused, imprisoned. Talk about feeling abandoned.
Right. And years later, he tells his brothers, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." That's some serious perspective transformation.
Speaking of transformation, there's this fascinating quote about how God often works in ways we don't understand. It says, "Truly, many times, I do not understand how God works. At times, He acts completely differently from how I would act."
So, what do you think that means for someone going through their own crisis right now?
Well, research shows that people who maintain hope during crisis situations have better outcomes. But here's the key. It's not about toxic positivity. It's about understanding that our perspective is limited.
Like when Hagar was in the wilderness, thinking she and her son would die, only to discover she was actually at the beginning of a new chapter.
Exactly. And you know what modern studies on resilience tell us? That people who can reframe their struggles as part of a larger narrative show significantly better coping mechanisms.
That's fascinating. It's like these ancient stories are actually blueprints for psychological resilience.
And here's where it gets practical. The input talks about care being more than just action. It's about seeing others as valuable, worthy of love. Studies show that perceived social support is actually more important than received support.
Oh, that explains why Jesus' response to Mary and Martha at Lazarus' tomb was so powerful. He didn't just offer solutions, he wept with them.
You know what's interesting about that? Modern grief counseling emphasizes the same thing, presence over platitudes. But there's also this crucial balance about self-care that we need to address.
The way you put that really brings it home. It's like what they say about compassion fatigue in healthcare workers.
Exactly. Studies show that caregivers who practice regular self-care show 40% less burnout. Jesus modeled this by regularly withdrawing to pray and recharge, even when needs were pressing.
That's such an important point about sustainable care. We can't pour from an empty cup, as they say.
Well, as we wrap up, here's what strikes me most. Suffering and care are deeply intertwined. The moments when we feel most abandoned often become the very moments that transform our understanding of presence.
Those are powerful final thoughts. It really brings everything full circle, from ancient wisdom to modern understanding.
And maybe that's the hope we can offer people today. That feeling abandoned doesn't mean being abandoned. The story isn't over yet.